Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story.
What would you do if a neighbor decided your private family road was now a public free for all? She cut my chains, threw the parties on my land, and then had the nerve to call cops on me. But when she filed formal complaint, she gave me the one tool I needed for the perfect revenge.
I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get into a property dispute with a neighbor. I'm generally pretty easygoing and I try to avoid conflict when I can, but sometimes conflict finds you anyway, especially when you inherit a piece of land that someone else has decided should belong to the community. My grandfather bought 120 acres of mountain property back in the 1970s when land out there was still affordable. He built a small cabin on it himself, mostly as a weekend retreat and hunting camp. The cabin sits about 3 miles off the main highway, accessible only by a winding gravel road that crosses through the property. My grandfather built that road himself too, back when he first bought the land. It took him 2 summers of work with a borrowed bulldozer and a lot of determination. When he died 5 years ago, he left the property to me. I was his only grandchild who'd shown any real interest in the place. My cousins all preferred hotels and resorts for their vacations. I loved the remoteness and the quiet. I'd spent summers there as a kid, and some of my best memories were of sitting on that porch at dusk, listening to the forest come alive with evening sounds. The property had always been pretty isolated. For most of my grandfather's life, there were maybe 3 or 4 other cabins within a 5-mile radius, all owned by people who minded their own business. But over the past decade, the area started getting more popular. People from the city discovered it as a weekend getaway spot. Property values went up, more cabins got built, and some of the old hunting camps got renovated into fancy vacation homes. The road became an issue almost immediately after I inherited the place. You see, my grandfather's property sits in a position where his private road provides the most direct access to several other properties further up the mountain. There are alternative routes to those properties, but they're longer and rougher. So over the years, some neighbors had occasionally asked permission to use the road, and my grandfather, being a friendly guy, usually said yes. It was informal, based on personal relationships and basic courtesy. The road became a private road, fully owned by my family as part of our land deed. When the county paved the main highway back in 1985, they rerouted it slightly, and the old connection point became absorbed into private property. My grandfather actually paid for a survey at the time to make sure everything was properly documented. So there was never any legal ambiguity about ownership, at least not on paper. When I inherited the property, I didn't immediately change anything about the road access. A couple of the longtime neighbors called to offer their condolences about my grandfather and to ask if the informal arrangement could continue. I said sure, no problem, as long as people were respectful. I wasn't trying to be difficult. Then Karen moved in. She bought a property about 2 miles past mine, further up the mountain. I never actually met her before the problem started. I'd see vehicles I didn't recognize using the road sometimes when I was at the cabin, but I figured they belonged to one of the neighbors or their guests. The area was growing, and I couldn't keep track of everyone. The first time I encountered Karen was on a Saturday morning in late spring. I was driving up to the cabin and met her coming down the road in a massive SUV. The road isn't really wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass easily in most spots, so I pulled over into a wider area to let her by. She didn't wave, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge me at all, just drove past like I wasn't there. I didn't think much of it at the time. The next few times I saw her, the same thing happened. No acknowledgement, no courtesy. Then I started noticing other things. Trash in the clearing near the creek where the road crosses the water. Tire tracks tearing up the meadow near the old hunting camp, evidence that people were using my property as a turnaround spot or a picnic area. I put up a few signs, nothing aggressive, just simple private property and no trespassing markers at reasonable intervals. I figured that would handle it. It didn't. One afternoon, I came up to the cabin and found fresh ATV tracks all over the meadow, tearing up the wildflowers that were just starting to bloom. I was annoyed, but still trying to be reasonable. I asked around and found out through another neighbor that Karen had been telling people the meadow was a community space and that ATVs were allowed. I decided it was time to actually talk to her. I drove up to her property on a weekday afternoon. Her cabin was impressive. Clearly a lot of money had gone into it. It was more of a luxury mountain home than a cabin, really. Multiple levels, huge windows, a wraparound deck. I knocked on the door. Karen answered, and I introduced myself. I explained that I owned the property down the road, that my grandfather had built the cabin and the road, and that I'd noticed some issues with people using my land inappropriately. She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "That's a county road," she said. "It's public access." I blinked. "No, it's actually a private road. It's part of my property deed. My grandfather built it." She shook her head firmly. "I did my research when I bought this place. That's a public access road. It's been used by the community for decades." "It's been used by permission," I said, trying to stay calm. "My grandfather allowed neighbors to use it as a courtesy, but it's private property. I have the deed and survey if you'd like to see them." "I don't need to see anything," she said, her voice getting sharp. "I paid a lot of money for this property, and access via that road was part of the value. You can't just decide to block a public road." "I'm not blocking anything," I said. "I'm just asking people to respect the property boundaries and not tear up the meadow with ATVs." "The meadow is community land," she insisted, "but everyone knows that." I realized this conversation wasn't going anywhere productive. "I'm happy to show you the documentation," I said. "The road is private, the meadow is private, it's all part of my property." She crossed her arms. "You need to take this up with the county if you have a problem with people using public land." I left, frustrated but still thinking it could be resolved with proper documentation. I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I sent Karen a certified letter with copies of the property deed, the survey, and the documentation showing the road was private. She never responded. Instead, the traffic on the road increased. I started recognizing vehicles that weren't from the immediate area. It became clear that Karen was actively encouraging people to use the road and my property. I put up more signs. They got torn down. I put up a chain across the road at my property line with a sign explaining it was private property and to contact me for access. The chain got cut within 2 days. I replaced the chain with a heavier one and better locks. It got cut again within a week. I started documenting everything with a trail camera. That's when I realized the scope of the problem. Dozens of different vehicles were using the road. People were stopping in the meadow for picnics. Someone had even started a fire ring near the creek. My private property had become a de facto public park, and Karen was at the center of it, telling everyone that I was just some jerk trying to illegally block access to community land. I consulted with a lawyer. He reviewed all my documentation and confirmed what I already knew. I was completely in the right, the property was unquestionably mine, and I had every legal right to restrict access. He sent a cease and desist letter to Karen and several other people I'd identified as frequent trespassers. Karen responded by ramping up her campaign. She started a social media group about preserving community access to public lands. She framed me as an outsider trying to steal community resources. The irony of this wasn't lost on me. She'd lived there for less than a year. I'd been visiting the property my entire life, and my family had owned it for 50 years. Then came the incident that changed everything. I arrived at the cabin on a Friday evening and found Karen and about 8 other people having a full party in the clearing near the creek. They had coolers, camping chairs, a portable speaker playing music. They were on my property, completely uninvited, acting like they owned the place. I walked up and politely asked them to leave. Karen stood up and announced loudly that they were on community land and had every right to be there. I stayed calm. "This is private property. You've been sent documentation proving that. You've been sent a cease and desist letter. You're trespassing, and I'm asking you to leave." "We're not going anywhere," she said. Several of her friends nodded in agreement. "Then I'll call the sheriff," I said. "Go ahead," Karen said with a smirk. Then she pulled out her phone and called the police herself, claiming I was threatening them and trespassing on community land. She told me the police were on their way and I should leave before I got arrested for trespassing on my own property. I stayed. So did she and her group. We stood there in awkward silence, them glaring at me documenting everything with my phone camera. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived about 45 minutes later, which was actually pretty quick given how far out we were. They looked tired, like this was the last thing they wanted to deal with on a Friday night. Karen immediately launched into her story about how I was harassing community members who were legally using public land. I calmly showed the deputies my property deed, the documentation of the road ownership, the survey maps, and the cease and desist letter my attorney had sent. I showed them the photos from my trail camera of the repeated chain cuttings. I showed them everything. The deputies reviewed it all. One of them made a phone call, probably to a supervisor or maybe to the county records office. After about 15 minutes, they told Karen and her group that they needed to leave immediately. that this was clearly private property, and that they could be cited for trespassing if they didn't comply, Karen argued. She insisted they had it wrong. One of the deputies, clearly losing patience, told her that she could continue arguing and get cited, or she could leave peacefully. She left, but not before telling me this wasn't over. She was right about that. Over the next 2 months, Karen filed complaints with the county about the road conditions, about blocked access, about environmental damage I was supposedly causing. Every complaint was investigated and dismissed. Each one cost me time and stress, dealing with county inspectors and providing documentation over and over again. Then Karen made the mistake that set up everything that followed. She filed a formal complaint with the county demanding that since I was blocking a road that the community depends on for access, I should either maintain it to full county public road standards with proper grading, drainage, signage, and accessibility, or open it for public use as is. She actually submitted an official petition with signatures demanding one or the other. The county sent me a letter outlining her demands. My attorney saw it and started laughing. He explained that she'd just given me the perfect legal framework for malicious compliance. She wanted the road treated like a public access road with official standards? Fine. I could do exactly that by treating it exactly like a commercial toll road, which private landowners are absolutely allowed to do. The inspector came out on a Tuesday morning. He was a friendly guy in his 60s who'd worked for the county for decades. As we walked the road together, he told me he'd seen this kind of situation before. Newcomers move to rural areas and assume every dirt road is public property. He took photos, measured the road width, checked the drainage, and made notes. At the end, he told me straight up that the road was clearly private, was more than adequately maintained for private use, and that I had zero obligation to improve it for anyone else. He actually seemed annoyed on my behalf that the county kept having to respond to this woman's frivolous complaints. His official report stated exactly that. Private road, adequately maintained, no county jurisdiction. When my attorney got a copy, he said it was the clearest shutdown of Karen's position we could have asked for, but I was done playing defense. Karen's petition demanding the road be treated like official public access had given me an idea. If she wanted it formalized, I'd formalize it. I hired a contractor to install a proper gate at the entrance to my property where the road began. Not a chain, a real gate, heavy duty with a coded lock and clear signage. I had private road authorized access only signs professionally made and posted every quarter mile. I registered the road as a private toll road with the county, which is absolutely legal for private landowners to do. Then I established a permit system. I calculated all my documented costs over the past 6 months. 3 cut chains and locks at $450 total, the gate installation at $3,200, multiple sets of signs at $600, trail camera and security system at $800, road grading and pothole repairs at $2,100, legal fees at $4,500, and my time spent dealing with trespassing issues and cleanup, which I conservatively estimated at 40 hours valued at $50 per hour for $2,000. Total, $13,650. My trail camera had captured footage of 67 different vehicles using the road without permission over that 6-month period. I divided the total cost by the number of vehicles, then doubled it to account for ongoing annual maintenance and future issues. That came to roughly $400 per vehicle for actual costs, which I rounded up to $1,200 per year to account for the ongoing burden and to price it high enough that casual trespassers wouldn't bother. The 3 legitimate property owners who actually needed access had no choice but to pay it until we worked out the permanent easement arrangement. I sent certified letters to every property owner I could identify who had been using the road, explaining the new policy. Effective immediately, use of the private road required an annual permit at $1,200 per vehicle. Applications could be submitted to my attorney's office. Any vehicle found on the road without a valid permit would be considered trespassing, and law enforcement would be contacted. The permit fee was calculated based on actual costs I'd incurred due to unauthorized use and necessary road maintenance. Payment plans were available. Unauthorized use would be prosecuted as trespassing. The best part was the letter I had my attorney send specifically to Karen. It thanked her for her county petition demanding the road be maintained to public standards or open for community use. It explained that I was complying with her request by treating it exactly like a public toll road, properly maintained, professionally managed, with official permits and fees based on actual costs. The letter noted that without her persistent demands that the road be treated as a public access route, I would have been content to continue the informal arrangement. Her pushing for official county involvement had forced me to formalize everything, and this was the result. My attorney said he'd never written a more satisfying letter in his career. Most people were outraged and refused to pay. I got angry phone calls and emails from at least a dozen people demanding I grandfather and free access for anyone who'd been using the road before. Some claimed they'd been using it for years, which was exactly the problem. One guy even threatened to sue me, but backed down immediately when my attorney sent him a letter detailing his dozens of documented trespassing incidents. Several people complained about me in local Facebook groups, but most of the longtime locals actually sided with me once they understood the situation. They knew the road was private and felt the newcomers were being entitled. Fine by me. I didn't want their business anyway. I wanted to be left alone. But there were 3 property owners who did need the access. Their properties were technically accessible by other routes, but those routes were significantly longer and rougher, adding an extra 40 minutes to the drive in good weather and becoming nearly impassable in winter. For them, access through my road made the difference between a usable property and a severe hardship. These 3 owners were reasonable people. 2 of them had actually been friends with my grandfather and had always been respectful about using the road. The third was a newer owner, but he'd never been part of Karen's nonsense. They contacted me through my attorney to work out a long-term solution. We negotiated permanent easements. My attorney researched comparable easement values in the area and advised that given the significant increase to their property values, having legal access versus being landlocked, anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 per property was reasonable. I set the fee at $15,000, which covered all my legal costs from dealing with Karen, compensated for the permanent loss of complete privacy, and was actually below market rate for what I could have charged. All 3 property owners consulted their own attorneys, confirmed the pricing was fair, and ultimately paid because without the easement their properties would have been nearly worthless. Karen predictably refused to pay for a permit or negotiate for an easement. She continued insisting the road was public and that my gate was illegal. She filed more complaints with the county. They were all dismissed. Then one morning, I got an alert from my security system. Someone had cut the lock on my gate. My trail camera caught the whole thing. It was Karen, bold as anything in broad daylight, using bolt cutters on my new gate lock. She cut through it, pushed the gate open, and drove through. I called the sheriff's department and sent them the video footage. They took it seriously this time. This wasn't a dispute over property lines or confusion about public access. This was clear-cut criminal trespassing and destruction of property caught on camera after repeated warnings. Karen was arrested at the scene and cited for criminal trespassing and destruction of property. Because of the clear documentation and her prior warnings, the prosecutor took it seriously. She posted bail the same day, but over the next few months the case proceeded. Her attorney tried to negotiate, arguing she misunderstood the situation, but the evidence was overwhelming. My property deed, the certified letters warning her, the posted signs, the video of her cutting the lock. She ended up taking a plea deal to avoid a trial. She paid restitution for the damaged lock and gate, paid court fines, and received a suspended sentence with probation. The probation term specifically prohibited her from entering my property. The legal case and the enforcement of the gate system had an interesting side effect. Several of Karen's friends, the ones who'd been part of her community access campaign, quietly stopped supporting her when they realized they could no longer use the convenient shortcut through my property. Some of them had been driving through multiple times a week. Now they had to use the longer route, adding over an hour to their round trip. I heard through the neighbor grapevine that Karen became pretty unpopular in her social circle after that. Turns out people were willing to support her crusade as long as it didn't personally inconvenience them. Once it did, their enthusiasm disappeared. Karen herself became much quieter after the legal case. I still see her vehicle occasionally on the long route around the mountain when I'm heading to or from the cabin. We've never spoken again. She doesn't wave. The 3 property owners with easements have been respectful and drama-free. We worked out a basic agreement about maintaining the road. They chip in for grading and gravel when needed. It's a reasonable arrangement between reasonable people. My cabin is peaceful again. The meadow recovered from the ATV damage. The wildflowers came back. I don't find trash in the clearing anymore. The only vehicles on my road are mine and the occasional easement holder, all of whom call ahead as a courtesy. Sometimes on quiet evenings, sitting on the porch my grandfather built, I think about how all of this could have been avoided. If Karen had just approached me as a neighbor, if she'd been willing to pay a reasonable fee or work out an agreement from the start, none of the conflict would have happened. I never wanted to be the bad guy in anyone's story. I just wanted to protect what my grandfather built and maintain the peaceful use of my own property. But she insisted on treating me like an enemy, on turning a simple property rights issue into a crusade, on rallying people against me based on misinformation. She forced me to formalize everything, to spend money on lawyers and gates and enforcement, and in the end, her pushiness gave me the exact legal framework I needed to do what I should have done from the start, establish clear boundaries and enforce them. I still use the cabin regularly. It's still my favorite place to get away from everything. The forest still comes alive with sounds at dusk, and the stars are still brilliant in the mountain darkness. My grandfather would probably find this whole situation funny. He was a practical man who believed in clear property lines and good fences making good neighbors. I've got the fence now. Still waiting on the good neighbors, but at least I've got peace and quiet. And whenever I drive through my gate, past my signs, down my road to my cabin, I remember that sometimes standing up for what's yours isn't about being difficult or unreasonable. Sometimes it's just about refusing to let someone else decide that your property should belong to everyone but you. Karen called the police on me for trespassing on my own land. She demanded I treat my private road like public access. And I did exactly that by formalizing every single aspect of private road ownership, complete with permits, fees, enforcement, and legal consequences. She got exactly what she asked for, just not in the way she expected. The next one is a malicious compliance story. This is my granddad's story from the late 60s to early 70s in England, and to note, he was very poorly when he told this to me, so this is the story that I managed to hear, so there's bits missing and not a lot of specifics, so all of this is what I gathered. Back when my granddad was younger, he used to work in a factory making engines for cars, and despite being a hard worker, he was always disrespected and underappreciated, and he felt it more so with his boss. And despite this boss holding very little or power over a very little area of the factory, this boss would constantly yell and exert his power over everyone. This story starts when the company buys this machine from Germany, and what I could gather from my granddad, this machine was like a computerized machine before computers were really a thing. So instead of one computer doing all of these complex calculations, you have pegs and wires that you have to physically move to work this machine. But he didn't say what the machine did. Now, obviously, this was complex, so the company sent a small group of workers to Germany to be taught how the machine worked over 3 months, and a group of Germans would come to England to build the machine. My granddad wasn't one of the people who went to Germany, so he stayed, but instead he watched the Germans install the machine, and despite the language barrier, my granddad understood how it worked and how to fix it, pretty much everything he would have learnt if he went to Germany with the other workers. After some time, my granddad got married to my grandma, and realizing he needed a house, he went to the bank to talk about mortgages, but the only issue is that he gets $22 a week when he needs $44 a week to get a mortgage. So he asked his boss, who promptly said no. Later on in the week, my granddad spoke to a mate of his who is now living in France, and the friend said, "I recently lost my driver's license, so I can't work for my company anymore, but they need someone to do deliveries for $48 a week between England and France." The next day, my granddad went up to his boss and asked, "Sir, who do I give this 2-week notice into?" And the boss, playing a power play, leans over my granddad, puffing smoke into his face from his pipe, and says in a low voice, "You hand that to me, you understand. I'm the boss here. I'm the most important." And my granddad handed it over to him. Over the course of the 2 weeks, it was normal until the last day when the manager came over and said, "Mike, I heard you're leaving today. Is that true?" And my granddad said, "Yes, boss asked me to give him my 2-week notice." And the manager went white, asking my granddad if the boss told anyone, listing anyone who had the same or more power than the boss did, even asking if the owner knew. And my granddad said no each time, with a bigger smile each time. And after everyone else on the factory went up to him asking the exact same questions, he couldn't hide his excitement. You see, what everyone failed to notice is that while the workers who went to Germany, they were in a country known for big beers and pretty women, so they learnt absolutely nothing in those 3 months. And anything they did learn was quickly forgotten when they learnt my granddad knew how to work and fix the machine. So because of my granddad leaving, he effectively left with the knowledge as he can't teach anyone else in his last 2 weeks. And that's if everyone else knew he was leaving in those 2 weeks. And the ending happened 2 months later when my granddad got a call from someone back at the company, asked if he wanted his old job back. And my granddad calmly replied, "No, I do not want my old job back, as I'd effectively be going back in life, especially back to a job that doesn't pay me well or treat me well." And for anyone wondering what happened with the machine, it ran well in those 2 months, but someone swapped the wires for the motors. As there was 2 motors, they put the wires into the wrong ones, and that's why they called my granddad, as they effectively lost thousands for the machine, the installation of the machine, and flying all the workers to Germany to basically just go on a bender. As for the boss and everyone involved, my granddad never bothered learning what happened to them, but I'd like to imagine there was a fallout and the fires of hell rained down. But this company was one of the more expensive car companies, so in all honesty, it could have been a minor setback. The next one is an entitled people story. I thought this would be funny to share. It is kind of long too, because I am just wordy. I am a 21-year-old woman, and today I was at a pretty popular theme park in Tampa for a work team bonding trip. There were over 130 of us split into little groups. It started raining pretty hard. No big deal. We were leaving soon anyway, so my supervisor, who is in his 30s, 2 of my coworkers, both women around 20 and 18, and I went to the ice cream place near the entrance. The line took a good while, which was mildly annoying, but whatever. Then a second employee came out. This older troll-faced woman, probably in her 50s or 60s, ran up to the left counter from behind us while my supervisor was ordering and started lecturing the poor employee about something. Then she demanded to order. The employee agreed. Personally, I would have sent her packing, but to each their own. The employee told her to order at the right counter, which was where we were standing. So this woman proceeded to shove herself in front of me and my coworkers after my supervisor stepped back. Then she gave us this pitiful little smile like we were supposed to be understanding of her and started ordering her stuff. I was not having it. At that point, we were all soaked, cold, and tired from going on rides all day. So I turned to my coworkers and, loud enough for her to hear, said something along the lines of, "Some people are just so entitled and think they're so special that they feel the need to cut in front of everyone else." I also said something about how some people apparently cannot be patient. She finished her order, turned to stare at us, and I ignored her. Then she walked over to the left counter. I started my order, then heard noises coming from the bridge troll. I looked over and saw her mocking me, saying, "Blah, blah, blah, blah," while doing the little talking hand gesture people do. She walked away, and while I turned back to the employee, I said out loud again, "You're a ducking 60-year-old making fun of 20-year-olds. The employee started dying laughing. And that was the end of it. My supervisor asked what happened, so I told him. He said I should not do that because I was representing my job. For the record, I was not wearing any kind of uniform or anything that would indicate where we worked, but come on. This is basic human decency and respect. I have had it with people stepping over me, so I am not holding back anymore. I know it is not much to post over, but I finally had something to share, so here it is. The next one is an entitled parent story. This is my second post here. For additional context, you can check out my other posts on my profile. Basically, I am a 25-year-old man, and I live in an apartment in the same building where I was raised. My family owns 4 apartments in the building, and my grandmother gave one to me when I was 22 so I could make it my own and live more independently. The problem is that my parents have never respected my privacy. When I still lived with them, they did not respect my personal space, and that behavior continued even after I moved into my own apartment. For example, they once used the emergency spare key I had left with them. Later, they justified it by saying, "We didn't have any ice in our freezer, so we came and took some from yours. That's okay, right?" That incident led to my first serious boundary. I told them clearly that they could not enter my apartment when neither my girlfriend nor I were there. I took the spare key back immediately after that. They now live in another city and usually come back to their apartment in the building about once a month. In general, they continue to disregard my and my girlfriend's personal space. I have been trying to establish firm boundaries, but they always seem to look for ways around them. Current situation. Last week, my mother came to town with a friend and planned to stay for about a week because of some medical appointments. She texted me saying she was in town and needed to give me back some money for something I had paid for on her behalf. I replied that we were not home and suggested arranging a time to meet sometime during the next few days. She said okay. Then, at around 10:40 p.m., she texted me again. Because of her drinking habits, she apparently wanted ice and did not have any. Since they do not live in the apartment full-time, the fridge is usually turned off. Her message was, "Did you guys get home? I need some ice if possible." I did not respond. The next morning, I told her that I found the request inappropriate because contacting me that late at night over something non-urgent like ice was not acceptable. She gave a brief apology, then immediately shifted into what felt like a victim role. Her response was essentially, "I'm sorry, I arrived late after 9 p.m. and needed something from you. But if you find that inappropriate, that's okay. I won't bother you anymore." The tone felt very passive-aggressive and self-victimizing. A few days passed and I decided I would see her briefly for about 20 minutes so she could give me the money she owed me. However, during our interaction, she continued presenting herself as the victim. Her justification for reaching out at around 10:30 p.m. was that she did not have cold water in her fridge and that the apartment was too warm because she did not have air conditioning. The thing is, the air conditioning issue was entirely due to her not knowing how to use the AC unit correctly. I find it difficult to accept that a lack of cold water and an AC problem she could have solved herself justified contacting me late at night in an attempt to get me to come over. To me, that feels completely disproportionate and unreasonable. What also concerns me is that my father, with whom I have my own difficulties, is coming to town for 2 days later this week. I already expect him to insist on seeing me and potentially wanting something from me. For example, during a phone call this morning, he told me that he needed to borrow my power screwdriver drill. What bothered me was not the request itself, but the way it was made. Instead of saying something like, "Hey, would it be okay if I borrowed your drill for a few days? I need it for X." It came across more like, "I'm coming and I need your drill." The expectation seemed to be that I would simply provide it without being asked respectfully or being given the opportunity to say no. That attitude feels very familiar and reflects a broader pattern in my family, where my autonomy and boundaries are treated as secondary to their wants and needs. Because of all this, I honestly think my mother may be capable of exaggerating or even fabricating problems, whether it is an apartment issue, a health concern, or some other emergency, to create situations where I feel obligated to come see her. I am worried about getting pulled back into the same unhealthy dynamic I have been trying to move away from. My questions. How do I stop feeling guilty for setting boundaries with her? Was my response appropriate and firm enough? How should I handle situations where she claims there is an emergency, knowing that I am only 3 doors away? If she starts exaggerating or faking apartment issues, which she has done before, or health concerns to get my attention, what is the best way to respond without getting pulled back into the same dynamic? How do I stand up for my belongings and refuse to give them to my parents unless they ask respectfully? I started seeing a therapist at the beginning of 2026, and it has helped a lot. I feel significantly better than I did before. Therapy has given me more confidence in recognizing unhealthy patterns and setting boundaries. I am also trying to lower contact, but I am seeing a lot of resistance from all family members. I am planning to move out of this apartment and rent somewhere else by the end of 2026. Any advice would be appreciated. Thanks. Anyway, thank you for watching.